Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Sim Pilot, and today we are taking another look at the PMDG 777-300ER. This will be a tutorial to show you how to set up the aircraft for its arrival, fly the descent, the approach and a landing. We're going to do that into Cape Town here in South Africa. I have previous videos on the channel showing you how to get it started all the way from cold and dark through to the taxi out, takeoff, climb and cruise to this point here. So do watch those videos first, but if you've already managed to get this far, then this tutorial will be for getting you on the ground again. I'm a real-world airline pilot, currently flying the Boeing 787, but I am also type-rated on the Boeing 777, so hopefully I can bring some real-world experience to your home simulations and give you some of that extra context. This video will help you out even if you're a beginner to Boeings or long-haul aircraft or even jet aircraft in general, but will also give you those extra tips and tricks if you're used to flying these airplanes in the simulator as well. As I say, we're continuing the flight, so we've done a long 12 hours down to Cape Town and we're now approaching our top of descent. So how do we get the airplane ready to fly the arrival? That's what we're going to look at today. Let's get started. So here we are on the flight deck then of our 777 and we are approaching the top of descent. You can actually see it here on the navigation display, top of descent T/D. So we need to get the airplane ready for our arrival. We've been sitting in the cruise in speed mode, so the throttles are controlling the airspeed. LNAV, so lateral navigation, following the magenta line that we planned out, and VNAV path. VNAV path is the vertical mode you'll spend most of the flight on in these long-haul Boeings. It just means that it's following where it wants to be at 38,000 feet. And we'll talk about the different modes and autopilot modes we'll use for the descent when we get to that point. So that will come very shortly. So we need to do a few things to get the airplane ready to fly the descent. First of all, I want to just quickly talk about the navigation display. You'll see I have terrain on, which is showing me the terrain around the aircraft, and you can see the higher terrain is shown at 10,100 feet. That'll be the strongest green color over here. You could also press WXR and have the weather radar. So typically at night, at least one pilot will have the weather radar on at all times, but if you're on a lovely day like this today and you can see the ground and there's no clouds out there at all, stunning day, then there's a chance you'd go to terrain instead, because you know there's no weather out there, but this might just give you a bit of a prior warning or give you some idea of the terrain around you, because it does show you the altitude numbers there. But there we go. So what do we need to do first to get the airplane ready? Well, we need to figure out how or what arrival we're expecting to fly. So you'd actually go and grab a weather for the airport you're expecting to land in. You can do that on the COM page, and depending if you have your network set up properly in the PMDG, you can go to flight information, and then you would go to ATIS request, and then you could type it in there. So we're going to land at fact, type it in, and then you could choose your source, but I don't have it set up right now, but yeah, you could send it like that, and then you may receive your ATIS if you're using VATSIM network, for example, and there was a controller there. You could select VATSIM and it would send it through and you'd arrive. However, something you can actually do, which is quite neat, is go to the performance tool, go to landing en route, and then you can just import the weather here. So I can see it's variable winds, 13 degrees, QNH 1023. Now this doesn't tell me the clouds and visibility, but it's good enough for just setting up the airplane for now. You would of course check the weather properly. You could either do that through another external source, or you can actually go to weather METAR and then have a look for any airports nearby. So here's Cape Town. And if you're lucky, Microsoft Flight Simulator will show you one, but it doesn't always, as you can see here. So there we go. So we know the weather we need for the performance. What this does tell me is with light winds, we could land on either runway. So the next step is I need to set up the box, just like we would have done on the Airbus. Let me get rid of that COM page. There we go. So I need to set up the CDU down here with the arrival and the flight plan, because at the moment that top of descent doesn't actually know how we're going to land. It just has a blank space. If we look in the legs page, it just ends at AirDAS, which is the end of our flight plan, and it doesn't have any more in there. So if we go home, go to the flight bag and go to our charts, whatever charts you happen to be using. If I go to star, I can see there are two arrivals via AirDAS. So that's perfect. One onto runway 19 and run onto the other runway, which is runway 01. So I'm going to plan to fly onto and land on runway 19 today, so I'll just highlight that, and then the approach chart needs to connect to that. So ILS Zulu runway 19, I'm expecting this chart here. Great. So now I'm going to go to my departure arrival page. I'm going to choose the ILS I'm expecting to fly. That's the wrong one. You see FAOR. This is gone automatically to the arrivals for our departure airport, because I did a slightly different flight plan to what we did earlier. So you need to go departure arrivals, and if you're on the wrong page, you can see here this is not where we're going, and the real aircraft does this as well. You have to go to index and then arrival, and then you can choose what you want. So I'm going to do ILS Zulu runway 19 and Air-1 Bravo, which it automatically tells me what to do. Now, before we actually activate it, because remember, it's not activated, or it's not current in the flight plan, it's just a plan, and we have this white execute light. Before I do that, I'm actually going to change the navigation display to plan, zoom right in, and then I can go to legs and step through, and I can step through even the plan. You see how it's highlighted down here. So you can step through and check it makes sense, and you can see here it actually just takes us round, and then it leaves us on a vector to fly that approach ourselves. And if I look back on the pinned charts, I can see that it has the, and that's the wrong one. Of course it is. Let's have a look. That's the one we want, and we'll take the ILS Zulu 19. Good. So pinned star chart, I've got the Air-1 Bravo, and you can see it just takes us from this CTV D11 at 210 knots at right turn 010. So there it is, and D11. So you have to think alphabetically. What's 11? Well, in the alphabet, so A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K. So K is 11 miles, so that K there means that is 11 miles out, and it's on the radial of 245, so it's the reciprocal 065, so that's why it's called 065K. So it's 065 radial, 11 miles, and then a right turn up, and then we'll just expect radar vectors round. So that all looks pretty sensible, so I could execute that, or if I go back to departures arrival, and you can see again it's gone to the wrong airport, so I'm going to actually just execute what we've got in there for now, and you can see it goes magenta. But you can also always change this by just going back in, choosing it again. So I could choose that, and then there are transitions as well. So if I choose the CTV1 transition and scroll through, you can see that it actually has a bit more of an arrival. It then has the full procedural arrival. So this is less likely to do, but this would be flying to the overhead and then outbound, background, and in again. This is what you'd do if there was not a radar vector or anything like that. So that's what that's showing me there. But I'm not going to do that, so I don't want that modification. I don't like it. I'm just going to hit erase. Pretty straightforward. So there we go. So now we have an arrival, and then we'll just pretend we're being radar vectored onto the ILS. You could, of course, also just fly at some point as you get nearer, direct to this waypoint here, and that would sequence the flight plan for you as well. But we'll talk about that once we're going down and how we'd fly the lateral modes. So there we go. So that's our flight plan set up. We know how we're going to get in, and we've had a look at our charts. Now, there's a few other things we need to do. We need to look at our landing performance. We know we're landing on runway 19, so I need to put in my landing en route, not landing dispatch. That would just give you the maximum weight. You need landing en route, and then you go to the airport, the runway, and it loads in the information, and then we need to put in the weight. So I'm going to load in the aircraft details. We're 211 tons, heavy airplane still, anti-ice off. So that's because it's nice and warm. If it was expected to be icing conditions on approach, so below 10 degrees with visible moisture, then we would have that on, and you usually just have it probably on just the engines, but you could have engines and wings, or just leave it in auto. We're going to have it off. Air conditioning config is on, so we're going to leave all the air conditioning packs on and alone. I'm going to land flaps 25 with no reversers, auto brakes 3, pretty standard stuff, no non-normal condition, and 5 knots. We've imported the weather, and then I'm going to hit calculate. And as you can see, this thinks we're going to stop in about 2,000 meters. That's pretty short. I'm always impressed. I'm not sure if this has the factor added in, but either way, plenty short of the runway. So that's given us a good idea. If you don't fit, things you can do are add reverser, and you can also increase the auto brake. So if I go to auto brake 4 or max auto brake, you'll see, of course, that the distance will be shorter. And obviously, if you go lower, it'll be longer. The best stopping distance will always be max manual, and as you can see, that's really short. Again, I struggle to believe it's doable in 1,000 meters, but there we go. So auto brakes 3 is what I'm going to use today, and reversers would also reduce the distance slightly, though that would be more effective on a wet or contaminated runway than a dry runway. And finally, you could also change the flap. So if I go to flap 30, it's going to be slightly shorter than a flap 25 landing, which is a little bit longer. There you go. Okay, so we've established that we can land auto brake 3, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set that up. So let's put the auto brake 3 in here before we forget, and it should appear as a memo up here. There it is, auto brake 3. Good. Let's now also work out the QNH, which is 1023. So let's set that on the standby instrument, just so it's ready to go. Just going to put 102. They're all connected, so don't do that if you've got them connected like me. Okay, we'll do that later. What we can do is backset that QNH. We can have it ready to go. So all you need to do is, without pressing the standard button, just go up here and just start scrolling. And you can see that I'm adjusting the QNH down here on my PFD. So 1, 2, 3. There we go. And you would typically set it up on the standby instrument, but mine are all connected, so I can't do that right now. There we go. Now, something to note about that is the landing weight it's got here, 211 tons. That is our current landing weight. If I go to initref index perf, it shows me that gross weight is, 217 tons. So it's expecting us to burn, basically, in the real aircraft you'd have to calculate your landing weight. So you can see here we're currently 217 tons. That is with 18 tons of fuel. On the progress page I can see we're landing with about 12. So that means we're going to lose about 6 tons of weight, so we'll be about 211.3 tons, 217 minus that 6 tons of fuel, and that would get us down. The alternative would be you could take your zero fuel weight, 199, and then add the fuel you're expecting at landing, which is about 12 tons, which again comes to 211 tons. So this is clever actually. This EFB is very clever. It's taken the weight we're expecting to land at. That's better than the real airplane. So there we go. So 211 tons is correct. So next, we need to load up the landing speeds. So I'm going to go down, I'm going to hit initref, and it will automatically take you to the approach reference. So initref is where your performance sort of information is on these Boeings. As you can see here, it's got landing flaps, settings, and speeds. Now we're going to go flat 25, which is normal, but you can do 30 as well, no problem. Like I say, just a bit slower, a bit less distance. So on a shorter runway you might do that, or if you want to reduce the temperature of the brakes. But you can see the gross weight is 217.2, but that's our weight right now. We've already established we're landing at 211.1, so I'm going to go 211. I'll just add a little bit, let's do 0.5, put that in there. It doesn't make much difference. You have to lose a few tons either way before even a knot changes, so don't get too bogged down with being like accurate to the kilogram. But there we go, so 25, 145, which seems pretty reasonable. And that VREF is 149. So yeah, that makes sense. It's about because we're going to add 5 knots onto that as we get lower, which we'll talk about on approach. So there we go. VREF is set up 25, 145. Now we need to also put in the minima. So if we go back to our charts, and I've got my approach chart, ILS Zulu runway 19, and we're going to do a normal ILS approach. So this is standard ILS. I have tutorials on my channel for how to fly an ILS in plenty of airplanes. But yeah, here we go. ILS is the favourite approach of modern airliners. It's got lateral and vertical guidance. It's very accurate, and that's what we'll show you today. But you scroll down to the bottom and you can see the minimums, and we're going to land, if you can maintain a missed approach climb gradient of 2.9%, then you can have 347 as your minimum, which is 200 feet above the runway. So I'm going to say we can do that today, but depending on your performance calculations, whether or not you would do that in the real world. But there we go. I'm confident that we can do that. So 347. I'm going to now need to put into my window. So now you go up to mins up here and start scrolling. It should be on baro, not radio. Radio is used for auto lands and low visibility procedures. So we're going to go to baro and then set that minima, which, as we said, 347 feet. 347. This, I talk about it a lot. These dials really, really wind me up. But this actually, that was one of the easy ones I've ever had. There we go, baro 347. So now this PFD is starting to ready for the descent. We've got the approach speeds, we've got the minimums, we've got the QNH back set. I'm liking it a lot. Let's put our navigation display back to the normal map and scroll out just to give us some situational awareness. Where's our top of descent? It's coming up here. Good, a bit further away. Right, what else do we need to do? We need to go into our CDU and just check a few things are complete. So we've done the flight plan, because we loaded in departure arrival, so that means our legs page is now looking good. We've checked through the waypoints to make sure they all work, and you can see here the constraints of 3,000 and above. Remember, we talked about those constraints in the previous video, in the climb video, so do watch that. But as you can see, 3000A means it will be 3,000 feet or above at this Charlie India 19 waypoint. If we go to our chart, that is this waypoint here, Charlie India 19, 3,000 or above, and then it will start the descent from the FI 19, which is the next waypoint at 3,000 feet. That restriction will go magenta when it's the applied restriction, but that's for later. we need to go to the NAVRAD and check that it has tuned correctly the ILS. Unfortunately, we're a bit too far out at the moment, so it's just in park. As we get closer, and certainly as we begin the descent, we'll just check, or just before we descend, we'll check that we have 109.1 and course 191 in on the NAVRAD page. I'm going to go to VNAV and just check in the descent page, so pressing next page, I'm going to check what speed it's planning to fly to make sure it looks sensible. So the airplane's expecting to fly a descent at Mach decimal 828, which is good. That's what we're at now, 829. And then it's going to convert on transition to 267 knots. So that's all looking good. What that means is as the Mach number increases slightly, it'll increase until it gets to 267, and then it will stay at that for the rest of the descent. As we go below flight level 100, the speed transition is that it will go from flight level 100, it will reduce to 240 knots. Boeing's always seem to do this by default, 240, not 250. The Airbus will go to 250, but there we go. Once you're all pretty much set up, like we are now, so just to recap, we put in the speeds, the minima, we've loaded in the arrival and the runway and the approach, and then later on we're going to check that the frequencies do tune correctly. We're also going to just finish up with a brief and just make sure you know what you're doing. Now I won't go through a full brief today because it's not really the purpose of the video. Your approach is going to be different, but you want to think about things like where is the terrain on this arrival. So as we can see, it's out here, so pretty high terrain, 6,500 feet is on this arrival chart. So you need to make sure that if you get lost, if you go above that, as we get closer in, we can see that it's actually 9,000 feet down here. So if we get lost, we need to go to 9,000 feet to make sure that we are safe from the terrain in the vicinity of where we're descending. Things like, is the approach a normal ILS? Is it a 3-degree slope? That sort of thing. So this is a 3.2 degree ILS, so it's slightly steeper than normal. So that just means we need to be a bit more careful with the energy management. But 3.2 is very similar to 3 degree. It's not going to make too much difference today. So I think all this, there's loads to talk about. The missed approach as well, but we're not going to go into too much detail on all of that because I want to just discuss how to set it up and fly the approach. On the progress page, we can actually see our arrival fuel is 11.7 tons. So we need to work out if that's enough fuel. Are we in a good position? Do we have options here? To do that, if you go to your flight plan, you'll see that it has your final reserve fuel, which you must land with 2.9 tons. So we must land with 2.9 tons in tanks, and our alternate fuel is 6.8 tons of fuel. So we need to have those two combined by the time we are on approach, because we need to have our alternate and final reserve. In all circumstances, you must land with your final reserve fuel still in tank. So we have to land with about 3 tons of fuel to be, otherwise we need to declare a mayday if we don't think we're going to do that. But anyway, the result is we're in a good position. We have enough fuel, and you can actually go to the initref index perf, and in here you can see, or you can type in how much fuel you want before the airplane shouts at you. So I want it to tell me at 9.6 tons it needs to alert me that we're having insufficient fuel and that we need to do something. So there we go. Pretty good. Once you're all briefed and feel like you're ready to begin your descent, it's time to to run the descent checklist. So go over here, checklists, and here's our, and this is in the wrong one, it's not sequenced right, so I'm going to go normal, and here's the descent checklist. Good. So recall, what we do is we press the recall button, again that's over here on the FO side, you press this cancel recall button. This then will say recall on the ICAS display. Did you see that again? There's recall written down there. What this is doing is it's just checking that any cautions in the background get brought to the front so you can't miss them. So there's no caution. So recall is checked. Notes, what it's asking here is, are there any notes on the electronic checklist? This is the electronic checklist. It would have an additional box down here that says notes. What that would mean is that there is an electronic checklist to do with a failure on the aeroplane sitting in the background, or that you've run already, and it's produced some notes for you. Those notes will be things like do not configure to this flap setting, or you must keep the engines above this RPM, or any other number of many thousands of things that the airplane might need you to do given that there's been a failure. So it reminds you of those. So it's telling you to read those notes, but we don't have any notes because the airplane is in good shape and there's no notes square on this bottom, so I can tick that. Auto brake 3, that's what we've set. The airplane doesn't know what we want, so we have to just tell it. Landing data, VREF, we've got 25, 145 and minimums of 347. So that goes tick. And then approach briefing is completed. That's the descent checklist complete, and then we just press checklist again and it's gone. The next one should be the approach checklist. Yes, there it is, ready to go. Good. So that's the descent checklist done. So let's talk about how you begin a descent in the Boeing 777. As we arrive at the top of descent, you would of course ask for descent clearance from air traffic control. Maybe they'll give it to you a bit early. And all you have to do in the Boeings, as long as you're in VNAV path mode, which you would typically be in the cruise, remember you want to be in LNAV and VNAV, you can just wind in the new altitudes. Remember, setting your altitude control to 1000. Auto is not used very often at these high altitudes. Auto just lets you set 100s, and it's also used in non-precision approaches we'll talk about later. So let's say air traffic control says descend when ready, flight level 300. I could just put 300 in the window like that, and you can see here 300 at the top of the PFD. And now we can just sit here and the airplane will get to the top of descent, and in VNAV path it will begin its descent down automatically. It would just change straight over and start its descent in VNAV. And that's great. That could be really useful. Now there is a chance, the first officers come to help us out. Hello. Thank you. There is a chance that you might want to descend early or air traffic makes you. So how would we do that? Well, in my previous video I talked about how you need to push in the altitude button if you want to override what's in there. So at the moment VNAV path wants to stay at 380. I want to go down to 340, or let's pretend it's 360. Let's say that air traffic has told us to go down. You could go into vertical speed and descend the aeroplane, just like we did in the climb. So vertical speed is a very basic mode. You could push it in and then fly it down. However, that would confuse the airplane. It wouldn't know you're beginning your descent, and the VNAV profile would actually expect you to climb back up to 380 until the top of descent point. So it gets very confused very quickly. Not the end of the world, but it's not ideal. The much neater way to do it is put 360 in the window, and air traffic have told us to go now, so I'm just going to click on the altitude, and there it is. Thrust, VNAV speed. So now the airplane will begin its descent down to 360, and it would trickle off the power, which it does very slowly, just like this. This is very accurate. I'm glad to see they've done this. It's just what the real airplane does. It's so slow. And now we begin our descent. And then it goes into hold mode. So what the airplane has done is it's decided it knows it's too early to descend. It knows it doesn't want to descend just yet. It's still got the top of descent in front of us. So what it's doing is it's just saying, okay, you want to go down, I'll do about 1300 feet per minute. It'll be between 1000 and 1500 feet per minute down to that level, because I don't want to go down too quickly, because I don't really want to go down at all. So it brings the thrust back, and then it drops it into hold mode, which means we now have manual control of the thrust levers, but you can just leave them where they are. But that's what hold means. It means that the autothrottle system has let go. So one way to remember it is if it says hold, you should be holding the thrust levers because you have control of them. But just leave them alone. It's set the right setting. It's descending a bit faster than that, actually. There you go, 2000 feet per minute. And it's in VNAV speed. Remember what VNAV speed means? If speed is written on the right side here, it means the elevator is controlling the speed of the aeroplane. So the airplane will now pitch to maintain that speed. So what you're basically doing is you're telling the airplane I want to go down now, and the airplane goes, okay, I'll give you a gradual descent, and it just it reduces the power a bit and then just flies the speed accurately on the elevator just to sort of gradually work its way down. And there we go, down at flight level 360. Now it's reverted back to speed mode, so that means the speed is now being controlled again by the throttles, and they'll increase gradually, and you can see that until we level out nicely at 360. So that was how you might start your descent a bit early, should you need to. So here we are back up at 38,000 feet. I've rewound time a little bit. Don't worry too much. The Q&A is slightly different the day I'm recording this, but there we go. Everything else is as we were, getting ready for our descent into Cape Town. Now, earlier we just looked at how to descend early using clicking in the altitude window to force the airplane to accept that there's a new descent to a new cruise level. And what the airplane would do then, we put in 36, and it then thinks it's going to cruise at 36 until the top of descent. There is a way you can actually force the airplane to begin its descent early. In the VNAV page, you'll see an option we're in the cruise page, so you can press VNAV, next page, and you'll see the option DES Now. If I press that, you need to have a lower altitude in the MCP window, because remember, this is still a hard limit. The airplane will not go through this window, which is a very handy feature. So you can put it in your new level, in this case it's back to 360, and then I can press Descend Now. What that would do is start the airplane into the descent mode. It would change to the descent speeds that we have over here, and it would show us a vertical profile to see whether we're high or low in comparison to it. So it's slightly different to how we were doing the last one, where I just told it to do basically a cruise descent down to 36, a bit like a step climb, but instead of step descent to 360. So that's what you would do. So if you were, sometimes when you're coming off oceanic airspace where you've been at 38,000 feet and then you'll enter domestic airspace of some variety, they might have to put you at a different level, and it may be that you have to descend. So in that case, you wouldn't press DES now, you would actually just press in the altitude control like I showed you, and then it would recalibrate itself to cruise at that new altitude up until the top of descent marker. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to press DES now, and it's going to behave as if we'd reached the top of descent, and it will start a descent and immediately realize that it's low on profile and then manage it like that. So if I hit DES now, then of course little white light, we have to execute, and here we go. It goes into thrust and VNAV speed. So it's going to set a thrust setting that it thinks is appropriate for the descent, VNAV speed because it's going to manage the descent, the vertical profile using the elevator, that's why it's on the right hand side, and then we look over here and we can see a vertical profile that we're actually on the vertical profile now. But almost immediately as we leave our altitude, there's the hold, so the thrust levers have reached the setting they think is sensible, which is just a little bit of a reduced thrust to start a shallow descent. And you can see here the airplane now thinks it's low on profile. What you get is this little profile over here. So the diamond is the actual profile, and the middle of it is where we are. So we are now below it. The profile is above us, 400 feet at the top of the scale, and now it's off the scale, and we're getting lower and lower and lower, because of course we should still be at 38,000 feet. And down we go. The RNP is the required navigation performance. That's how accurate we are to the profile it's trying to fly. The AMP is the actual navigation performance, 161 feet. So that's how well it's calibrated and how well it can fly the profile. Don't worry too much about those numbers. They're not important for us in flight sim right now. Yeah, RNP, AMP is a whole other thing. So 1,000 feet to go, and we're going to descend to 360. So if you were expecting to fly a descent early or for any other reason, you might choose that. But I must say, I never really used descend now. I'm more likely to do what I showed you earlier. So what I could do is if I press previous and put in the cruise altitude of 360 and then execute, you'll see that we've now forced it back into cruise mode, because I've told it the new cruise level is actually at 3.6, and now it's happy again. And then if we go to the next page, I can see that the descent has not started and the descend now option appears. So there you go. That's another way to do an early descent, or indeed another way to change your cruise level if you want to do that. So now we're back at 360, speed, LNAV, VNAV, path, and the top of the descent is coming up. So next I'm going to show you the most normal way to begin your descent in the long haul Boeings. So here we are, finally at our actual top of descent. It's only 10 miles away, which won't take us long at all. We're going over the ground at pretty impressive 468 knots. So around now you would get a message, reset MCP altitude. This is the aeroplane complaining that we have not got a low altitude in the window, and therefore it's going to miss its top of descent. It's a nice reminder. Then you would call air traffic control and say, we'd like to request descent. Air traffic control hopefully will say something like, descend when ready, flight level 300. So we'll put that in the window. That clears the FMC message. The airplane will now begin its descent at the T/D, the calculated top of descent. Now, sometimes air traffic control won't be that nice, and they'll say to you what we saw earlier, which is descend now, flight level 300. In that case, you could do what we did, either clicking it in until you then regain the VNAV profile, because you'll still be in VNAV, so it will still start its descent, or it will still intercept the descent profile, or you could put it into vertical speed for a little while until it intercepts it. Lots of ways to do it, but remember, we essentially want to fly the descent in the VNAV mode. So yeah, it's like I say, this is the Boeing descent modes are just something else, especially if you're used to the Airbus. So here we go. Any second now, and you can actually see it on the VNAV page. There you go. So it shows you the angle and vertical speed it's expected to fly in the descent mode. It shows you the speeds it's planning, so it's going to fly at decimal 818 and 267 knots. And down we go. Idle, LNAV, stays in VNAV path because that's where we want it to be. Thrust levers are now gradually reducing, and they are this slow in the real airplane. I've said before, they are so slow, and often it leads to you immediately getting high on the profile. The 787 is prone to that. I believe the 777 does the same thing. Just update the heading bug. You can see, however, this time we're doing okay. We're actually slightly below the profile, so the airplane will now adjust itself using VNAV path mode to fly correctly on that profile. So it's commanding idle thrust from the engines, we can see that, but that can change. The airplane can choose what it wants. It's flying in VNAV path, so it may add a bit of power if there's a shallow segment. For example, this descent is an idle descent because there are no restrictions until the 3,000 feet or above, which is, as you can see, the next restriction, which shows on the VNAV page. This is now going to become a very useful page. So it's in magenta. Likewise on the legs page, if I scroll through, as we saw in the climb tutorial, the magenta is the next restriction that the airplane is obeying. It's the active restriction. And it's a 3000 or above, so very easy. If the next restriction was, for example, an ERDAS and a below restriction, the airplane would then try and manage itself onto that profile. So what I could do is type a restriction in. Let's say air traffic control says be level at Charlie Sierra Victor at flight level 200. So I can put in slash flight level 200 and then type it in at Charlie Sierra Victor and then hit execute. And now you can see the airplane thinks we're high. So it's changed the thrust mode. It's now in VNAV speed and hold. What's happened here is, because we are off the profile, it changes to what's called VNAV speed. This is because it is not in VNAV path, because it can only be in path when it's on the path it calculated. And now we are high. It's got a new calculated path, and it shows us as, look here, the diamond's below us. We're 450 feet above the diamond, 450 feet high. To fix this, you can go for the speed brake. A little bit of speed brake out, because remember, speed is on the right. So the airplane is controlling speed with the elevator. It's in hold mode on the thrust levers, so those are just being held. Those are being let go by the auto throttle system because it's left them at idle where it wants them, because it knows that's what it can do, and it's given up. So we've gone for the speed brakes. It may well give you an FMS message to tell you that that's what's happened and that it's too high and it needs drag. And there we go, idle VNAV path, because we've reached our profile that we've just asked for. So now remember, put those speed brakes away. We don't want them out otherwise. Good. And we're back on profile. Likewise, you could accidentally get below the profile, but that won't happen now, remember. We're in VNAV path, so if I was to leave the speed brakes out now, let's put them out, what you're going to notice is the speed gets low, and we're at leveling off. Let's imagine we got a further descent from air traffic control. They've cleared us down to flight level 150. And you'll see here, the speed's just getting lower and lower because the throttles are in hold mode, and finally they've woken up, going to speed, and now they'll drive forwards. But the VNAV path mode is still active. We're still on the vertical profile, we're just slow. So that's why you need to be very aware of what's going on with your speed and the throttles. So like I said, you won't get low. Now if I could trick the airplane into thinking we are really high. So speed brakes is one way to do it, but I could also, if I change that restriction, let's put it to flight level 160. It will recalculate. There you go, it's decided it needs idle at VNAV speed because we're now 3,800 feet high. There is another way to increase the descent rate. So speed brakes is the easiest and probably one of the more common ways to do it, because for the reasons you've seen there, it allows you to get quickly back on profile without fiddling with anything else. But here's a way to make it more complicated. Just like in the Airbus in open descent, you can open the speed window even in VNAV mode. So it's in hold, which has brought the thrust levers to what it thinks it needs to fly that descent, which obviously is idle, and then it's let go of them. So you could now move these manually, but you don't want to. You don't typically need to. In hold mode, you very rarely actually adjust the thrust levers yourself, if ever. You don't really need to do it. So don't worry too much about hold, but it just has commanded idle and left them there. It doesn't stay commanding idle. It's unusual in the Boeings, but there we go. So anyway, we're not going to regain the profile. It's 3,100 feet below us, and we're only gradually intercepting it. So I can actually open the speed window by clicking on it. So when I'm closed, it's just being controlled by the aeroplane's VNAV speed, which as we can see on the VNAV page is now 267 knots. But I can open it and then wind it up. So let's put it up to 300. And just like in the Airbus in open descent, now it's going to lower the nose and increase the rate of descent to try and reach that speed. Because remember, the thrust has come to idle because it knows that it needs idle because it's too high. And on the right, it's in VNAV speed, so the elevator's controlling that speed. And there we go. That's another way to do it. That's something we don't have available to us as in quite the same way in the Airbus, so quite handy. So you can just open that speed window, let the airplane dive down to the profile, and if it's still not enough, you could just go for the speed brakes again. But what you need to remember if you do this is, once again, it's going to eventually regain VNAV path, and then you want to close everything back up again. So put the speed brakes away. The other thing we've done here is, because I've accelerated the airplane, it's going to struggle to reduce the speed again, even once it regains the profile. So if I keep winding the speed up, watch this, and this is where you need to be careful with your energy management. So we are diving down now, almost on the profile. You can see it's coming up shortly, and I'll show you what you can do once you intercept it. It's really struggling here, so I'm going to have to use the speed brakes because we are very high and now we are fast as well. So speed brakes out, the speed reduces, the airplane, remember, in VNAV speed mode, so it will have to lower the nose to keep the speed. And now we're going to regain the profile. So what modes do you expect it to go into? Well, it may be a surprise to you. So I've managed to drive the airplane below the profile by using the speed brakes and the extra speed. I'm going to put the speed brakes away now. You can see the profile is 500 feet above us, so speed brakes away. I've now closed the speed window. It's in LNAV and VNAV, so the speed will wash back. And now the vertical profile is coming back to meet us, and I'm expecting it to go into VNAV path and then carry on its descent. Idle, VNAV path. And there we go. So now we're at the calculated speed and profile, so it all worked out. But you've got to remember, if your speed was high, for example, if I open that speed window and drive it up and let ourselves get high on the profile or low on the profile, you need to just be aware that when you close the speed window, you could have the wrong energy position and the airplane will struggle to get back to the right speed. So you've got to be aware of your speed. So that's why a lot of pilots will just use the speed brake as a simpler way of doing it. Good. And there we go, we're going to make the 160 at Charlie Sierra Victor. Now, other vertical modes, of course, we can always, let's imagine we've cleared down to flight 100 now, we could always just press vertical speeds, and just like any airplane, you get speed mode on the left, so the throttles are controlling the airspeed, and we're flying vertical speed on the right. Sadly, it doesn't show us anywhere what we've asked for. I think the Airbus FMAs, flight mode annunciators, this little bar up here, is a bit better because it would tell you what you've asked for. Here, you can just see the little magenta on the right. It's not great, but there it is. So up here is the easy place to look, just confirm it on the PFD. And also you can check it's up or down more easily visually on the PFD. So we're in vertical speed, and now we can just choose whatever we want. 900 feet per minute, no problem. It will just raise the nose, it will do 900 feet per minute, and it will add power as it is doing now to make sure that we keep the right airspeed. Very straightforward. What if we want to go down really quickly? You can press flight level change. When you press flight level change, the aeroplane will aim to get to that level, the commanded level, in 2 minutes. So because that's 2 minutes, it was going to take us longer than that, it's going to just go to the most it can do, which is idle thrust and then maintain the speed over here. Now when you press flight level change, notice in VNAV the speed window is closed, but in flight level change it opens. So this is the most similar to open descent in the Airbus. Now I can just wind the speed on and the airplane will dive down thrust, flitch speed, flight level change speed. If you were very close to your level, let's say you're only 2,000 feet away, then it would only do 1,000 feet per minute, for example. But you can see here we have total control of the speed, so the airplane will just fly that because it's in flight level change speed. So what it does is, the hold mode is, it just calculates what it thinks you're going to need, and then it sets the thrust to that, and then it goes into this flitch speed mode. So let's put it back into VNAV. There we go, thrust VNAV speed. We're below the profile here by about 350 feet, so if I just leave it here, it will eventually go back into VNAV path. And let's just say I want to go to flight level 130. So I press flitch speed, and you'll see here it will command the thrust. So the thrust mode is now in thrust. It's moving the thrust levers, and it's actually increasing thrust this time because we're so close to the level, and it wants to do about 1,000 or maybe even less feet per minute. And there's hold mode, so it's happy, that's the right amount of thrust, and now it will just go down to its 130 at a nice gentle speed. So flitch is quite useful, but remember, if you're near the level, it will not be the quickest way to get to it. You'd have to open the window, and what you could do is, because it's gone into hold, you could of course just close the thrust levers yourself if you wanted it to go quicker. So up until it does this speed out, so it's now leveled off, so speed is now being controlled by the throttles again. I hope this is making sense. It's a challenge for me to explain because it is a complicated system. Speed, LNAV, VNAV, alt. So there we go, we're at the altitude that is not part of the VNAV path, so we're just going to get VNAV out. Right, let's imagine we're cleared to descend now to 80. Actually, let's just check our transition altitude. What was it? Transition level normally by ATC, of course. But there we go. No altitude restrictions on here, so I won't worry too much, but there we go. So we're in LNAV, turning at AirDAS, and we're on our profile. So the profile is now as the airplane expects it to be. By the way, something I should have said is, in short-haul airplanes, we often turn on the seatbelt signs around about 10,000 feet. On long-haul, you'll need to do it earlier, so I would put them on earlier than that. Somewhere around 20 minutes to landing, which could be around about 20,000 feet, is quite typical. But airlines will vary that. Some will do it at the top of descent, some will do it 20,000 feet, some might do it later. But it takes a long time to prepare that cabin. And I believe, as this is the PMDG, we should see things like, yeah, they've reopened the curtains now in the cabin. This is great. They were across earlier. It's very clever, very clever. Close that door. Good. So this is really what we want. Speed, LNAV, VNAV path. We want the airplane to be descending on its calculated profile. That's the most efficient. That will mean that our fuel plan also ties up, because remember this fuel figure is based on us flying that profile. And then we would fly this arrival, and at some point expect radar vectors. Brings me to the next point. Notice that I can go into heading select, and the airplane will just fly that heading bug. If I now turn the heading bug, it will turn with me. If I want to go back onto the lateral profile, I'd need to get a direct to or something like that organised, or intercept the line. So if I turn away from that magenta line, and I showed this in my climb video, but I just want to show it to you again in case you didn't see that or you're not used to it. So we're turning away, just got to be careful of the terrain beneath us here. We did say it's about 10,000 feet, so maybe I'll put 9 0 in the window. So we're now turning away from our lateral profile, and if we get far enough away from the magenta line, the airplane won't re-engage LNAV. It will say you're too far away, and we're not going to intercept it because we're pointing away from that pink line. So you have two options. You can either turn back towards the pink line and have LNAV armed, or you could do a direct to, in which case the pink line will immediately be redrawn from where you are to the waypoint, and then you can follow it. So I'll show you both of those now. The final thing I want to show you though with the vertical mode is we can stay in VNAV. Have you noticed we're still in VNAV path even though we're no longer on the magenta line? That is a trick that the Boeing can do and the Airbus cannot. It is one of the more advanced bits of automation, thrust VNAV speed. So it's carrying on in its sort of VNAV profile even though we're not following that line. However, it can get confused quite easily like this because the track miles are all changing, and you can see here we're just getting below the profile because we're actually flying away. So it's not as useful as you might imagine. There you go, hold mode, so I can now have the option to just increase thrust a bit. And now it's gone to speed mode anyway, so it's going to keep flicking through as the sequences. Yeah, it's not the neatest way to do it. So what you could do, we're being dragged away from where we want to be. I don't want to go too close to these hills. I'll just do a nice gentle 500 feet per minute. Now, as I was saying with the lateral navigation, if I press LNAV now, you'll see it's armed, it's in white, but it can't do it. We're pointing away from the purple line, and we get the message not on intercept heading. Quite right, airplane. So what you would do, and remember you're most likely being controlled by air traffic control, so this is not a likely scenario, but you could fly your airplane back. This is just if you're experimenting in the simulator, and now the airplane will fly on this heading, and then it will intercept this line. The two waypoint is in front of me, Delta 065 kilo, so it would intercept the magenta line and then fly towards that waypoint. That is not an unreasonable thing to do, but again unlikely if you're being controlled by air traffic control. More likely is air traffic control has taken over from us and they've said fly direct to Charlie India 19. To do that, we need to go and fly direct to. There are no direct to pages in here. I'm going to press legs. I'm going to take the waypoint I want from any of the pages, so it's Charlie India 19, select it, and then put it to the top. It's got to be page 1 of the legs page, top left. There it is, there's a white line, and then I'm going to hit execute. Now we are high, we're 800 feet high, and we're also a little bit fast, of course. We've gone through 10,000 feet, so let's put the landing lights on. Seatbelts are already on. And we're going to need to set the QNH. Cabin ready, excellent. Now it's 3,000 or above, so I'm going to put 3,000 in the window, and I'm going to press VNAV. Remember, let's say you had restrictions, a restriction in front of us that said 4,000 or above, the next one said 5,000 or below. As long as you're in VNAV mode, it will obey those restrictions. That's why we like being in it. What you can do is you can just put the lowest altitude in of the arrival, so basically the platform altitude, the platform altitude of your ILS. So our platform altitude today, when it loads, is 3,000 feet. So we could just put the 3,000 feet in the window up here, and then make sure we're in VNAV, and then it will obey the constraints, whether it's 5,000 or above or below. That's one reason to use it. Now you can see we're high on profile, going to need speed brakes, out they come. Now, here we have the Kilo Sierra India 191. I remember I said we should check that it has tuned. On the NavRed page, here's the ILS 109.1, 109.1, 191. And just to check the DME is... Oh, it is an ILS DME. Yep, good. And just checking it does read 0 at the thresholds, which it looks like it should. So our platform altitude on this ILS today is 3,000 feet. So that's why we have 3,000 feet or above in the constraint, and we are going to put that in the window and descend down towards it. Now this is an altitude, so we need to change over to the QNH. Today the QNH is 1013, so I've got it preset here, and I just press standard, or the standard button, and it now swaps over to HPA. If you're flying in America, of course, you'll have this set to inches, and you'll do the same thing, which equates to 29902. So there's our QNH of 1013, and now we're on the correct one. It will go amber as you go below the transition level anyway. So just to remind you that you need to swap it over. Good, and now we're on our profile, and you can see we're on the vertical profile and we're heading in towards CI19 3000 or above. So in this mode I could fly an LNAV VNAV path, and it will fly down, it will fly the descent, and it will start slowing down, and you can see at FI19 it has a restriction of 170 knots in magenta, so it would slow down to that. And here is a bit of a problem. We don't want to let the airplane slow down itself, because we can't in the Boeing let it do that, because the airplane will target the speeds and it will potentially slow down through them, and we need to have flaps out by then. So what's very common is at this stage of the flight to take control of the airspeed of the airplane and the vertical speed yourself. So you can leave it in lateral navigation, but it's very common to open the speed window and select the speed. So I'm going to slow down to the up speed. That is the slowest I'm allowed to go at this point. We cannot go below that green up until we have some flaps out. And that is now true for each stage of flaps. So I'll show you what I mean as we go through. So I'm going to slow down to up, and that's the slowest I can go whilst clean with the flaps in the up position. What this means is now we're going to get high on the profile because the profile disappears beneath us, so you may want to use some speed brake. And this is why instead of using VNAV at this stage of the flight, it's very common to put it into other modes such as vertical speed or flight level change and manage the energy yourself. So how do we do that? Well, the energy management is very similar to how it was on the Airbus. At 15 miles to touchdown, and remember you have your DME up here, so it may or may not be aligned with your runway perfectly, but in this case they are pretty much aligned. We're 17 miles from the runway, or I can see the track miles I have about 20, so I'm okay to be doing 220 knots, but I need to think about my 3-degree descent. So if I times my current altitude by 3, so 6 times 3 is 18, so I need 18 miles to land. So I'm actually about on a 3-degree profile. I'm just a little bit I'm just still clean, so I might need to use speed brakes to slow down a little bit. Keep that in mind for the rest of the descent. You've got your VNAV profile is here, so if you want to, you could just try and stick to that as best you can by using the speed brakes. So I could put the speed brakes out, and I could put it into, and it will do its best to get back to it, even though I've selected the speed. So that's one way to just keep driving yourself onto the VNAV profile, and that's quite a common way for pilots to do it because it means that you're staying on the airplane's computed profile, and I have control of the speed myself. But then you've got to think about slowing the airplane down. When do we want to do that? Well, at 15 miles to go, just like on the Airbus, maximum speed of 250 knots is what I'd recommend, and then just count down by 10 knots each way. So you'd count down from 15 miles at 250 knots maximum, and then let me just put the speed brakes away as the engine's spooled up. And then at 10 miles, 200 knots maximum, 9 miles, 190, 8 miles, 180 knots, 7 miles, 170 knots. Remember that is miles to touchdown, so some DMEs, especially in America, are misaligned, so you could be 2 miles closer maybe, or further away, so worth keeping that in mind. Let's imagine now that we're on radar vectors, and they're giving us headings, because that's also a common way to end up flying an approach. So let's say they say you're clear to descend to 4,000 feet, and I want you on north onto heading 010, just to get us out of the way. This is not uncommon. So in that case, you put it into heading select, so you're flying around on the headings, and you'd put your altitude in the window, but you can see we're in VNAV path, so I would probably take over, put it into vertical speed, although now it's leveled off at the altitude anyway. So these are just some other ways you might manipulate the airplane around the air using the autopilot. So heading cell is where it will follow you. You'll see this hold button. If I press hold, the airplane will simply roll out and fly the current heading it's at. We don't ever really use that. Heading cell is much more useful because it just follows the heading bug. Same with altitude. The out hold light is on here. So for example, if I was to, let's say I put the airplane to 5,000 feet, put it into a gentle climb. So I want the airplane to climb at 1,500 feet per minute to 5,000 feet. There we go. So VS 5,000 and it's climbing up. You can press the hold button and the airplane will just level off where it is. It will go into out hold and hold the current altitude, a bit like VS 0 on the A320. So these are just some other modes available to us, but rare to use. So let's go back to 4,000 feet. Flight level change. Oh, it's pretty happy, it's close enough, and we're in heading cell. You'll also see that the runway is now disappearing behind us, and what could be useful is to have an extended sense line, because this vertical profile that it's planned is assuming we're flying along this magenta line, which we're now clearly way off. So it wouldn't be uncommon to be sort of vectored around, maybe not quite like we're doing here, away from the runway, but to be vectored around the airspace and then eventually pointed down the runway to intercept the ILS. So there's a way we can do that. Nice and simple on the 777. Press departure arrival, and then you'll see straight away the next waypoint has an intercept option. So I can press that, intercept, and it asks us for the inbound course. You simply put in the inbound course of the landing runway, which today is 191. So I'm just going to type in 191, and you see that dashed white line, looks sensible, execute. And now we have drawn out behind us an extended runway sense line that draws all the way into infinite. So that means as long as we're pointing towards that line, which we're not right now, but if I turn the airplane around now to point towards it, it's going to give us a vertical profile roughly of what we would need to be on. So it could give you an idea if you're high or low. So remember, the most simple way or basic way of calculating how many miles you need is to times your altitude by 3. I'm at 4,000 feet, so I need 12 miles to safely get the airplane down a 3-degree approach to the runway. So at 4,000 feet, I expect to be descending at around 12 miles to go. If I was at 5,000 feet, I'd need 15 miles. If I was at 10,000 feet, times by 3, I need 30 miles. So these are all things to keep in mind. Now, although our DME, we're 22 miles from the runway, we're also slightly offset, so it would be a little bit more than that. Good. Just hopefully just giving you some exposure to flying around with the autopilot in the Boeing 777. It's very, very different to the A320. And like I say, those vertical modes are one of the hardest bits to get your head around, especially coming from the Airbus, or it certainly was for me anyway. So configuring, as I said, we're doing 215 knots. So that speed I'm quite happy to be doing up until about 12 miles to go. 220 knots up until 12 miles, but then I want to slow down. 11 miles 210, at 10 miles 200, at 9 miles 190, right back to our approach speed, which today will be 150 knots. You will add 5 to that, which we'll see later. So how do we achieve this? Well, we're going to just join the ILS, and then we'll begin our descent, and we'll descend down to our platform altitude of 3,000 feet, vertical speed. So this would be a more normal way, so you're being vectored by air traffic control, using vertical speed, having the speed window open and choosing the speed yourself. These are very common ways of doing it. And let's just put our heading round to a sensible intercept of the runway, 220 degrees. Good. Now we have a strong tailwind on this approach. You can actually see we've got 22 knot tailwind, so that's going to make things interesting. So in that case, you might want to think about putting the flaps out a bit early. The speeds I gave you would work with a nice gentle headwind, but with a strong tailwind like this, we don't want to start down the ILS glide slope, which we can see coming in here, until we have some flaps out, because we need that drag from the flaps. It's a very slippery aeroplane, 777-300. That wing is very big and clean and beautiful, but it does not slow down very well. It's designed to be efficient and not have a lot of drag. And we're in a very big and heavy aeroplane, so we need to do our best to sort that out. So if you're not sure, the simple option is get some flaps out. I don't need to be clean at 18 miles. It's time to start slowing down, especially with that tailwind. So let's go to flap 1. Remember, we cannot go below the green up until we have flaps 1 out. So the speed limits are shown here. Flap 1 is 265 knots. So I'm going to put out flap 1. Lever moves. Then I want to check on the ICAS. Does it appear and have I selected the right flap? 1. That's good. And now we get a little green 1 on the speed tape. So I can slow down to that speed. As soon as I've selected it, I'm allowed to slow down to it. I don't have to wait for it to have actually moved into position in normal situations. Now we've just gone through the localizer there, so I'm just going to turn it back around and intercept from the other side. And we'll talk about how we intercept that. So let's get flap 5 out. So flap 5 speed, 245 knots. We're below that. Flaps 5. And now the green 5 appears, and I can select the speed back to the 5. Right, now we're on intercept heading. I can press localizer, and then you'll see localizer in white because it's armed. It's important to remember that you must arm the localizer first, depending on the fit of the airplane. So there are some 777s that would actually start down the glide slope even if they haven't intercepted the localizer. That's not safe. It's not what the procedure is designed for. So it's quite common to do this, where you arm the localizer. There we go. Localizer is captured. It's now intercepted it, and you'll see it moves the heading bug round to face down the runway. So now I can arm approach And all that would do is add in the glide slope as arms, and the glide slope sitting above us, as you can see. So as I was saying, some 777s have it set up so that they could actually descend on the glide slope even without being on the localizer. So it's quite common to just arm the localizer and then arm the glide slope. Now on the Airbus you could just arm the approach and it would only do that once it would only go down the glide slope once it was on the localizer, but some 777s wouldn't. So it depends on the fit. That is an option in the PMDG menu for doing that. Right, here comes the glide slope, and yeah, we've still got that strong tailwind, 24 knots now, so let's get some more flaps out. So let's go to flap 15, a bit more drag. That's 230 knot limit, we're below that. Flaps 15. Now in terms of putting the gear down, it would be normal to do it around 6 miles or 2,000 feet above the runway. Remember, on a 3-degree slope, that would be about 6 miles, would be 2,000 feet. But that's 2,000 feet above the runway, you have to account for the elevation. So if the airfield's at 500 feet, that would be 2,500 feet altitude on the QNH. In a moment we'll see that the radio altimeter will come to life, and that would be another way of judging your height above the runway. There you go, 15, let's slow the speed down. This is going to be tricky to keep the energy out of this aeroplane actually. So there's flap 15, so we've got a fair bit of drag. There it is. And down we go. Got to keep on top of this now. So we're in speed, lock, glide slope. We can now enter the go around altitude, which is 4,500 feet. So I'm going to put it to auto. Remember, if you need hundreds of feet, you put it to the auto side, 4,500. And you heard that 2,500, that's the red out coming alive, so here it is, 2,200 feet above the runway. So you can see that we're slightly closer to the runway than our altitude would suggest because it has about 150 feet elevation. So at 2,000 feet, which as you can see is coinciding with 6 miles, I'll lower the gear. Now we have a strong tailwind, so I'm going to lower the gear a little bit early. We'll go gear down. Once you've lowered the gear, I'm going to arm the speed brake. Speed brakes go to the armed position, and then I can go to flap 20. Flap 20 has a limiting speed of 225. That's pretty high actually. So we'll go to flap 20, and now we have quite a lot of drag out on the airplane, but we've still got a strong tailwind that's reducing and becoming a headwind. But there we go. The airplane is starting to get into line with where we want it to be. Don't think we need to do anything more. Finally, we go to landing flap 25, 200 knot limit, so we're below that. Flaps 25, and there we go. Now we set the speed bug to sit on top of the VREF, so you add 5. So it's going to be 150, which means it's sitting on top, as you can see there. Now what we should have done is the approach checklist when we set the QNH, so I'm going to do the approach checklist now. Altimeters are done, and then we go normal. Landing checklist is checklist complete. Then we close that. So the main things we got for the landing to make sure we're set up to land, we got the gear down, we got the auto brake, we got the gear down, flaps are at landing flap, speed brakes are armed. Now to land the 777-300, there we are, stable at 1,000 feet. We are going to simply fly it down. I'm going to disconnect the autopilot in just a moment. We are going to flare basically when it says 30. So flying down the approach, keep it on profile. Can't believe we're thinking there's traffic. I haven't got traffic turned on. We're going to keep it on profile, and then we are going to start looking out the window as we get a bit lower and a bit closer. And all you need to do is flare at 30 feet, so a little bit of a nose raise. The airplane will automatically close the thrust levers back to idle, let the main gear touch down, then you need to hold the nose gear off so it doesn't crunch in. The spoilers will come up automatically, and you'll check that, and then you're going to select the reversers to reverse idle is all we need today. So there's the autopilot off. Press the button twice to stop it continuously warning you. Flying down, I'm looking in, now I can start looking out, 2 whites, 2 reds, looking towards the touchdown zone, and now looking towards the end of the runway. 30 is the flare. Airplane idles automatically, holding it there, holding it there, holding it there. There's touchdown, holding the nose up so it doesn't crunch in with the auto brakes, heard the speed brakes deploy, and then we get an idle reverse. Now just using the rudder to keep it straight as we roll out. And that's all there is to it. It's actually, I've not flown the 777-300, but I've heard it's very nice to land. Indeed, pilots prefer landing it to the 787. And there we are, rolling out. Now I know that was quite a lot to take in. We'll do a full landing tutorial and probably a full ILS tutorial as well to cover the approaches, because there's so many details to go into those and they're such dynamic things. But for the landing, it's quite simply take out the autopilot, fly it towards the touchdown zone, and then when it says 30, that's when you flare. It will automatically close the thrust levers for you. Set that parking brake. So all you need to do is just get the main gear down in the touchdown zone, and then let the nose gently come down and get the reversers out, and you'll make sure the speed brake comes up, but you can hear that it does make a noise as well. Here we have our landing wing view, and some interesting things I want to point out about the 777 on final approach that the PMDG have modelled correctly. You'll see here that the aileron is actually deflected up. This is part of the landing attitude modifying system that will actually put the flight controls in sort of all these different positions to make the airplane efficient and correct stable attitude for final approach. You'll also notice as we land, you can hear there the demand air pump come online, and then on touchdown some spoiler panels deploy there, and then until the nose lowers enough the rest won't deploy, and now the rest come up. Again, accurately modelled by PMDG. Really impressed with that. Very cool stuff. And now of course the inboard aileron rises to dump lift off the wing for the landing. Very cool. Very, very impressed. So that's all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. This was a big video with a lot of information in it. It will probably take a couple of goes to soak it all in, I imagine, because the vertical modes are, like I keep saying, so different to the Airbus. So I hope it's useful for you. Do let me know in the comments if there's any other questions you have and what topics you'd like to see me cover on the channel, and hopefully I can make that happen for you in a way that can be as clear as possible. But like I say, a complex big machine with a lot of modes, so the descent is certainly one of the more challenging parts of operating this fantastic aircraft. Great to see it simulated so well here in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been useful for you. Plenty of guides and tutorials to come on the channel, as well as live streams, so do please subscribe if you'd like to see those. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.